I trust implicitly the wisdom, the intellectual smarts, the insight of my readers. I don't think I have to lead them by the hand.
I'm Michael Tamblyn, CEO of Rakuten Kobo. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is the novelist and book designer CS Richardson, whose first novel, The End of the Alphabet, won the 2008 Commonwealth Writers Prize for Best First Book. His new book, All the Color in the World, is a kaleidoscopic novel about a boy's love affair with art and a man's struggle with loss. And while we have him here, I get a chance to talk about his other career as probably Canada's most celebrated book designer. CS Richardson, welcome to Kobo.
Thanks, Michael. Lovely to be here.
This is a beautiful, moving book. It is also a very difficult one to describe. The exceedingly brief intro I just gave it is all I could say to the listener other than you've just got to read it. How do you describe All the Color in the World?
Oh boy, it's a mixed bag. It's a miscellany of fiction. There's a liberal sprinkling of nonfiction in there, but in essence, it's the story of an everyman through the trials and tribulations of his life and how he copes with the trials and ultimately survives, I think, all through the power of art and his love of art.
The book takes its time getting to the protagonist, Henry. It strolls along without hurry to even confirm that there will be a protagonist in any recognizable sense. Can you introduce Henry to us?
Well, yes, Henry. Henry is a young Torontonian, born and raised. He is a boy gifted with, one might argue, an overactive imagination. He loves his boys' own annuals and his comic book papers. The novel begins with his birthday he's born in 1916. And we follow him from there on in at various key points in his life. We meet him first when he's a young 5-year-old. We meet him next when he's grown into a preteen, and so on. But at the beginning of the novel, he is a young, very imaginative boy, keeps much to himself, and just loves the creativity of his adventure stories and tracing illustrations and whatnot.
The opening chapters read like the French novelist Annie Ernaux's The Years, where we're almost getting this historical and objective third-person observation, but constantly getting pulled closer and closer to the eye of the observer. Was this a story about Henry, or did Henry emerge from a story or a feeling you were trying to create?
No, this began its life as a story about Henry. What I was striving to do with the intermingling of the fiction and the nonfiction was to tell Henry's story a slightly different way, where there are only so many basic stories of lost and found, and love's lost and found, and coming of age, and redemption stories and whatnot. And Henry, this is as much a coming of age story as anything else. But I wanted to tell that a different way. So initially it was Henry, and then what drove Henry was this profound love of art, and how that art and how various aspects of nonfiction informed his life.
Henry is an art historian who copies paintings and teaches art using the paintings he has copied. He specifically doesn't use the slide trays and carousels of most art historians. The questions surrounding copying and replica, learning through copying on one side and then the originality of art on the other side comes up frequently. Was there something specific you were exploring there?
I mean, it's a surprising fact about art history and the development of various artists and how they learned their craft and their trade. It by and large, I mean, whether they were Van Gogh or whether they were Picasso or anyone else who we would think their genius sort of fell from heaven and was landed fully formed. I don't think that's the case. I think the case is that they learned from others. They copied other paintings. They copied artists who had come before. And I think Henry knows that fact, and to immerse himself in the works of the people the art that he is teaching, he is copying them, and he is trying to bring to life something that under normal circumstances, he's teaching in the 1930s and 40s, and the quality of slides and whatnot, and the quality of reproductions in textbooks, particularly about art, is not the greatest. So he is trying to bring these artworks to life as close to accurate as humanly possible.
That mode of learning art, of apprenticeship through replica, kind of reached its end around that time, 1930s, 1940s, after which point the primacy of the new took over. Mm-hmm. And was there something particular about trying to capture that point in time where like artistic replica just meant a very different thing than it does now?
Well, I mean, actually, Michael, you make a very good point that with the growing prominence of what the art world terms as non-representational art, i.e. abstract art or expressionist art, the notion of copying your forebears to produce a quality representational art, which is what preceded the modern movement, the notion of that sort of fell by the wayside. I will argue, though, that I would bet you money that art students today, part of their curriculum is to go into a gallery and sit in front of a classic painting, something by a master, and copy it, to learn basic fundamentals of composition, of color, of balance, of line, of anatomy, all those kinds of things. Whether or not they're going to go on and do representational or non-representational art, that remains to be seen. But they get that grounding in how their forebears produced art.
This book, with its short chapters and historical interludes, has the feeling of an especially well-curated and impressionistic slideshow. After the first 6 or 7, 1 and 2 page chapters, you start to feel the rhythm of the book, and that shortness starts to feel spacious rather than clipped. You said back in an interview, I think more than 10 years ago, for your first book, The End of the Alphabet, that the words will do the job. You don't have to lead the reader by the hand. And that idea that you can let imagination fill in the blank spaces. Are you intentionally encouraging that kind of engagement of the imagination, or does that just fit in with the way you like to tell stories?
No, I'm intentional. It is entirely intentional. I mean, it's It's the way I like to read. And I trust implicitly the wisdom, the intellectual smarts, the insight of my readers. I don't think I have to lead them by the hand. Again, I didn't want to lead them by the hand with this one.
Mm-hmm.
I trust that in fairly short order, even though it is an unconventional structure that I'm using with all the color in the world, that they will get it, and they will be engaged, and they will bring their own sense to bear. It was a very conscious decision in terms of what art that I talked about. It's very difficult to describe a piece of artwork to somebody who's never seen that piece of artwork. So there was a deliberate choice made on certain pieces of art that I knew were popular. I knew that people would have seen them in some guise somewhere along the line. So that was deliberate. But in terms of being as spare and as lean and letting the words do the work, absolutely, it was conscious, and I suspect I will continue to do that with the next novel and then one after that.
I will confess, I did a quick count to see if the number of chapters in the book matched up to the number of slides in a slide carousel, but it turns out you're about 45 over. Both both your first book and this one are certainly the epitome of more with less.
Yeah.
And as you say, that's very deliberate on your part. As you're writing, do they start bigger and then get pared back, or does that economy come naturally to you?
Oh boy, it depends. I mean, there are certain points in the process where I am paring back, and there are other points in the process where I am struggling to flesh out. I tend to write lean to begin with. Mm-hmm. But there are points where, and my editor will attest to this, where I need to add more. I'm not giving the reader quite enough.
There's not leading them by the hand, and then there's abandoning them in the dark.
That's exactly it. And you use the term very well. It's you've got to. It's a balancing act for sure. You've got to tell the story. You have to give the reader certain benchmarks and certain signposts and certain talismans. I think by and large, I mean, I write lean to begin with. So I will write lean. It's the kind of book I like to read. I'm long done with, the doorstop books. Not that there's anything wrong with those books, but I tend to read lean, short, for lack of a better term, European writing, where the doorstop novel isn't quite as prevalent.
Was there a particular author, or are there authors who really embody that style for you? Either people that you were inspired by, or just people who make you feel like I'm not alone in this form of expression?
Yeah, there's more than a few. There is the terrific Italian writer Alessandro Barrico, who his most notable work that people would know would be Silk, mm-hmm. which is even shorter than All the Color in the World. It is a perfect exercise in concision. The French novelist Jean Arsenault writes very economically and really, really well, and tells a compelling story by doing so. There are a few Canadians. Kim Twee comes to mind. Her novel Rue is something most people would recognize. Again, a short novel, very lean, very sparse. But in terms of telling stories without a lot of fireworks or gymnastics, I would like to say. There's everybody from Keel MacLear, who's I'm a fan of. Ali Smith in the UK, I love her writing. Nonfiction, Julian Barnes cannot be beat as far as I'm concerned. Simon Schama, he writes big fat books, but he writes them very, very well. And he writes them, they just clip right along. There's no superfluous fat as far as I'm concerned.
You have talked about finding inspiration in art, in paintings, in film, in illustration. Is there a pile of images that gets accumulated as you're working your way through a manuscript?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly in the case of All the Color in the World. But yeah, I did a lot of visual research. I mean, I studied art history in university, so I was revisiting some things that I'd learned, I don't want to say how long ago. But there was pieces of art and circumstances that I didn't know as well as I should have. And so I was accumulating all kinds of art and bits and pieces about art, visual, non-visual. I mean, the book is set partly in Toronto in the 20s and 30s. And there's no better place to go for archival material than your local archives. And there's a ton of photography that was done during that period. I had a lot of images from the Second World War in Sicily, which is where part of the book is set. So yeah, I accumulate a ton of stuff.
When people buy this book, and they absolutely should for both of our sakes, I will do something that I have never done before and advise people to read the copyright page, because it turns out that each surface of the book, front cover, back cover, end papers, flaps, spine, has a different painting on it, along with with paint itself, which is also meticulously credited, so that you could be sure that you know the source of each swipe of teal and cadmium yellow and Cambridge blue,
yeah,
all of which make an appearance in the story. Was there a thought to make this even more illustrated at some point, or is that just a book designer who can't hold back?
Well, the book has been designed by the formidable Kelly Hill, mm-hmm. who's designed all of my books. She is arguably one of the best book designers working in this country, and has been for the last 20 years or more. We did have a meeting, a creative meeting, a design meeting, where discussion of concept and direction was had. The notion that this book could be an illustrated novel, like fully illustrated, is more a notion in my head than anybody else's. I would love if my publisher deemed it so worthy that they could do an edition like that. That would be fantastic. But in terms of what Kelly has done, she's clearly read the book. She's clearly pulled pieces out of the book that would work as either entire images, i.e. like the front cover photograph, or as in details, as with the spine or the back cover. So yeah, I mean, I think it was, without speaking for Kelly, I think it was a labor of love for her, because it's a designer's dream to have so much visual referencing and so much visual material to choose from.
The End of the Alphabet was 2008. The Emperor of Paris was 2012. And then we had to wait 10, 11 years for All the Color in the World.
Well, thank you for waiting.
It was well worth the wait.
Well, thank you.
I'm curious about what kind of bell goes off that makes you decide it's time for a new book, and what does that part of your brain do in between those times?
The bell went off for All the Color, what became All the Color in the World, shortly after The Emperor of Paris was published. I have an idea. I mean, I have a queue of ideas in my head, or a scrap of paper written down somewhere, while I'm working on something else. Like I've begun preliminary work on my next novel, and All of the Color in the World has just hit the stands. So the bell goes off very early. The bell very, very early in the process. The problem, or the challenge, it's not really a problem, it's a challenge, and was for me, is, life gets in the way.
Mm-hmm.
You have a day job, and you're raising a family, and circumstances being what they are, and you're getting through life. And so there's few hours in the day to concentrate on the writing, but it's never out of my head. This All the Color in the World has been in my head for 10 years in one form or another. And, you grab a moment here or there. I was very lucky. I'll be probably the only person in the world who said that the pandemic was the best thing that happened to me, because suddenly I was freed up. Suddenly I had lots of time. I was not distracted. I didn't have other things to worry about. And my productivity level just went through the roof at that point. But it's always in my head, and I can fully expect whether the next one takes me 2 years or 5 years, it'll always be in my head. The bell has gone off, and away we go. But I don't stop thinking about it. As the old saying goes, writing is more than typing. And for me, it's work. It doesn't flow out of me like water. Mm-hmm. I work very hard at my craft and learning my craft.
You have had a literally illustrious career as creative director and book designer for Penguin Random House. That's a 40-year span of career. And you retired, is it just recently?
I didn't retire. I hate the word. I left Penguin Random House 5 years ago.
Okay.
Almost to the day. So yeah, I've been more or less writing, quote unquote, full time for the last 5 years.
I'd love to go to the beginning of your design career for a moment and just talk a bit about how you started, how you got into that work.
I fell into it. It's literally, I answered an ad in the paper. I'd come out of university where I had spent a fair amount of time working in graphic design and graphic arts and whatnot as part of my art history training. And so I came out of university looking for a job. And I answered an ad for a small publishing house. They were looking for what they called a promotions assistant, whose one of many responsibilities was to design their book catalogs. Just back in the day when publishers had catalogs. Mm-hmm. So that was my first gig in publishing. And while I was there, I was lucky enough to work with a production manager. The publishing house where I worked, they published a few titles, not very many. And I asked the production manager if I could take a run at a book design, at a book cover design. Mm-hmm. At that time. He said, sure, absolutely. And I, fell in love with the process. I fell in love with working for something that was that tangible, i.e. a book that would hopefully last for a while. And quickly discovered that designing books is like designing nothing else, because every book is different. Every single book is different. There's no template, at least there shouldn't be. But for me, there was no template for a book. Everyone was treated differently, and the ability and the collaborative aspect of working with editors and with authors, I just found so stimulating.
One of the reasons I ask is because the whole idea of commercial art versus non-commercial art comes up in the book. You mention N.C. Wyeth, the American realist painter, gifted collaborator with authors, who grew to resent depending on commercial work to support his career. Yeah. Did you ever find you came into it through design? So you kind of your expectations were fairly well set. Did you ever find yourself working with people who struggled with that divide?
Wow. Yeah, the odd time. I mean, I worked with some authors who were very concerned about the aesthetic of their book covers. We'll talk about book covers.
Mm-hmm.
For me, cover design is book design. I'm designing the whole book inside and out. I worked with some authors who were very concerned about the aesthetic of their covers. And to the point of nitpickiness and wringing of hands and whatnot, without much thought as to how that book was going to look on a shelf, how it was going to look in an ad, whether that ad be online or in print. So there was some gentle sort of hand holding as it wasn't just me. It was the author's editor, the publisher, the sales department, the marketing department, all of whom, we worked in tandem to do as gently as possible, convince the author that aesthetics are great, but if nobody can see the book or if nobody can understand what that cover is in one form or another, if it's so intellectual and so esoteric that people are just not interested, then they're just doing the book a disservice.
Mm-hmm.
So there was that the odd time. Most authors I dealt with, and certainly editors and the people in the publishing game, were well aware that as artistic as literature is, there's a certain element of commercial involved in every book, whether you're Michael Ondaatje or Stephanie Meyer.
In that interaction with the author, the emotional stakes are high.
Oh, yeah.
I'm curious about, in the management of that dynamic, was that something that you got better at over time, over the course of your career?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was doing it for a long time, so one would hope I got better at it. But you're absolutely right. I mean, particularly with first novelists and first-time authors, fiction or nonfiction, these are their babies, and I constantly reminded myself of that fact that while I was working on the project, I might be working on it for 6 months and then I'd be on to the next thing. Mm-hmm. At the published house. For them, this was their life's work. They were going to have to live with this book for the rest of their lives. They had lived with it for who knows how long. I mean, some people write 20 years before they finally get a book deal. So I was very cognizant of that fact, and so you tend to be as gentle as humanly possible. That said, most of the authors I dealt with, whether they were first timers or whether they were vets, were very appreciative, and it was like magic. They would come in with this manuscript, and then the next thing you knew, you would show them a visual interpretation of that manuscript, and they just thought it was like you were pulling rabbits out of hats. They really, really enjoyed the process. Yeah, that was really a lot of fun. I mean, to see an author see their cover for the first time, it's really good.
I bet. Some designers have their moment and then fade. You kept evolving and changing through your entire career. Was there ever a time when you felt out of step or pushing against the tastes of the time?
No, never. I don't think I ever felt that at all. I mean, what drove every design I did, throughout the years, was the book itself. Mm-hmm. What was the book I was working on? What was that content of that book? What were the hopes and fears of the publishing house for the content of that book? Whether it was novel, whether it was nonfiction, every book was special. Every book was different. So I didn't worry. If something I did was going to be out of step, didn't even think about it. But if something I did was going to be out of step, that meant that the book was out of step. And I don't think many publishers publish books that are out of step. No, I didn't care about trends. I mean, obviously I followed them. I looked at them. Mm-hmm. I mean, I admire a lot of my former colleagues and fellow designers, both at Penguin Random House and elsewhere. And, I cheer them on as anybody would. But I wasn't worried about whether, red was the color du jour or whether this typeface was better than that typeface. If it fit with the project I was working on, then I would use it.
Your time in book design spanned almost 40 years.
Yep.
Could you isolate some things that have changed about how publishers think about books as visual objects?
Oh, boy. I think the biggest effect or the biggest factor in book design, and particularly cover, we'll talk about cover design again. I think the advent of digital marketing,
mm-hmm.
of ebooks, I mean, the format itself, but primarily the marketing, online, on a digital format, on a website, that has driven, or not driven, but it has heavily influenced cover design, I think, over the last, 20 years, I would guess, 15 years. Again, going back to what does that book look like on a shelf? Well, if that shelf is the size of a postage stamp and it's on a website, that's going to dictate to a certain extent what you do,
mm-hmm.
And how you treat type and how you treat an image and what kind of images you pick. So that's been certainly a determining factor is the advent of digital marketing and to a lesser extent ebook, but because an ebook cover by and large is a cover.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, I think that's it. Where you've moved away from not necessarily the physical book, but you're reproducing the cover of the book very small or in a very different way, and there's no two devices that will show you the same JPEG or
right
or PDF. So if you could spend months worrying about the color palette of your book cover, but on somebody's phone it's going to look like this, and on somebody's iPad it's going to look like that. And so yeah, it's a bit of a tough road to hoe, but it's a challenge, and you overcome it as best you can.
One thing I'm curious about, and it's I've got you here, so I have to ask. It seemed to me that as that focus on finding covers that work well in a digital environment was getting embedded in publishers' design practice on one side, there also seemed to be a turning towards making those books that would be in stores more beautiful physical objects.
Yep.
It seemed like we saw, kind of materials get richer and both, internal and cover design get more focus on it as publishers were trying to make sure that the things that did go into stores were compelling as objects.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I mean, for myself, I was fundamentally concerned. I mean, if you step back and you're asking a consumer to spend, I mean, these days it's getting into the $40 and plus for a novel. You're asking the consumer to plunk down a fair amount of money. You want to give them their money's worth. And if that means a better grade of paper, or if that means a little bit more bells and whistles when it comes to the jacket or the cover, i.e. embossing or foiling or die cutting or whatever, if it means printing something on the end papers, then so be it. I mean, I was a huge champion of considering the book as an object, and hopefully giving a consumer their money's worth. Over and above whether the book was a compelling story or if it was a great novel or not, I was worried about it as an object as much as anything else. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And and I think as printing technology, as design technology made things a little bit easier and more efficient to do, then yeah, the need and the desire to make a physical object as best as you could only got better.
And so now we can all begin our campaign for the fully illustrated, richly produced, expanded edition of All the Color in the World.
Here's the ironic thing. I mean, I never thought about it as an illustrated book until I was done. After I'd finished with the editorial process, and I'd gone through that with my esteemed editors and whatnot, it occurred to me one day, I went, man, this would make a really nice illustrated book.
It really would.
It really would. But now we're talking huge and expensive, and you want to give the consumer their money's worth. It's going to cost them a fortune.
It'd be worth it.
And yeah, I mean, and I think it goes back to my days as a designer, a book designer. I mean, my favorite books to design were illustrated books because there was just so much to do. To the point, I mean, I loved designing cookbooks because there was so much going on. But illustrated books were my fave.
Now that you aren't having to supervise a creative department and a pipeline of new books, does that mean we might see a next novel from CS Richardson, in less than 10 years? I'm not asking for a lot. I'm just asking for less than a decade for the next one.
You can rest assured it will be less than a decade, or I will die in the attempt. I'm telling you. I mean, I love All the Color in the World to death, but 10 years with that that's plenty. That's more than enough.
Excellent.
I've started to work on the next one, and again, my time is a little more free than it used to be. So yeah, I think I can safely say it's going to be much less than 10 years.
Scott, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. It was a real pleasure. It's great to talk about design. It's great to talk about books. Absolutely. Really enjoyed it.
I've been speaking with the novelist C.S. Richardson. His new novel is All the Color in the World. Find it and all the other books that we've talked about at kobo.com/conversation, or tap the link in the show notes. Wherever you're listening right now, also tap the subscribe button so you don't miss any of the fantastic author interviews we're lining up for 2023. Kobo in Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj. I'm Michael Tamblyn. Thank you for listening.